The reason for this, I think we all know, is there is a business in misinformation, and it's been gaining steam in a lot of ways. We all know from listening to congressional hearings of the past year the role that things like Facebook play, but in particular the role that this metric of engagement plays in terms of big advertising and media dollars. And misinformation has been proven to generate engagement. So I think on that note, I'd really like to ask each of you, as succinctly as you can, because we only have 45 minutes for this session, to give me your take on what can be done to impact those economics that are driving this insidious, destructive force that's driving us apart.
Well, let me start if I can, Joe, if you don't mind. We did a report, NewsGuard did a report with ComScore a few months ago, where we actually measured the dollar impact of misinformation. And what we discovered was that ad dollars, that programmatic ad dollars going to sites that we had rated red, and you really have to be pretty bad to get a red. You have to be selling, fruit pits as a cure for cancer, or saying that vaccines will kill you. It amounts to $2.6 billion, billion with a B. And what my partner Gordon Krovitz and I were stunned by when we launched NewsGuard, we thought most of the misinformation we would see would be related to politics and political propaganda. And there is a lot of that. Sure. There are some 4,000 advertisers who advertise on Stop the Steal sites through programmatic advertising. But the overwhelmingly largest category is healthcare. And that's because there's so much money in it. So there are healthcare fraud sites that, again, will tell you that fruit pits will cure cancer, or the vaccine will kill you, or that Fauci is being bribed by Pfizer and Moderna. And those sites get ads from every brand you can think of, or at least they were until IPG and Publicis started using NewsGuard as another layer of protection, a filter to keep them out. So when you think about misinformation, you not only have to think about the demand, which is, the algorithms that send people down rabbit holes, but you have to think about the supply. And the supply is motivated largely by money. Now, some of it is political propaganda. Warren Buffett probably doesn't know it, but every morning he sends money to Vladimir Putin because Geico is the largest single programmatic advertiser on RT and Sputnik, and its ad agency, whoever it is, and its brand safety company, whoever they are, is doing nothing about it because they can't, because they use artificial intelligence, not the human intelligence that NewsGuard uses.
So I don't want to make this a big plug for NewsGuard, but obviously we're big fans. No, but I have a follow-up question for you, which is a lot of what you're doing now is enabling advertisers and agencies to make better bets through inclusion or exclusion lists, to put where to put their money. But is there a higher order thing you can play in terms of shedding light on these good or bad actors and where they're getting their ad support from?
Well, it's a little touchy because if we, when we put out a report, as we've done in the past, that names the brands that are advertising on these sites, it pisses off all the ad agencies who have been telling their clients for years, don't worry, we use IAS and Double Verify and Moat, and we've got this covered. And it embarrasses them. So their first reaction is, why are you embarrassing us in front of your clients? Some of the people in the agencies, as I mentioned, Publicis and IPG, and we're now heavily in discussions with Havas, see that it's not their fault. And the essence of all of this is it's actually nobody's fault. That's the problem with programmatic advertising. It's not like anyone at the agency wants their clients to be on these places. It's not like Double Verify and IAS want to be doing this. They just don't have the capability because they think this is a tech problem. It's not a tech problem. At the end of the day, it takes trained human beings to realize, hey, guess what? RT is a Russian propaganda site. And even if it has a couple of stories from the AP on it, it's still a Russian propaganda site, and we shouldn't be financing it. So there is a higher order, and that is everybody needs to be sensitive to this and realize they shouldn't be pointing fingers. It's nobody's fault. It's just that the whole ecosystem of programmatic advertising grew up around the notion that that algorithms can deal with everything. And when it comes to fruit pits curing cancer, algorithms cannot deal with it.
Well, Ben, you're a reformed ad tech guy, so you come from the dark side. How are you working, or even better yet, what would you recommend the ad industry do to become more aware and avoid those fruit pit sponsorships?
Yeah, so picking up on Steve's points, I think there's a quote from Upton Sinclair, right? One of the original muckraking journalists. It's impossible to explain something to a man whose salary depends upon him not understanding it. A gendered quote because of the time, but it's instructive, right? And I think that is the case that ad tech has to answer, which is ad tech often says the solution is a technology one. And in the case of these issues with misinformation, it's not. It is about human review. We sundered this relationship between media, the connection people have with media, and relied heavily on algorithms in this industry to sort of make that decisioning. And this is where it leads us. It leads us to a place where it's possible to monetize disinformation through systems and platforms. I think the advice I would give and the responsibility we have as buyers, investing wisely and doing good media for and with our brands, is to, one, ensure that you are not automating those decisions. Human insight is media. Humans consume media, not machines. We can talk about ad fraud, and that's another issue. The second thing I would say is, there is a problem with the controls, or I would say the availability of filtering perhaps in platforms. Now, what I mean by that is, if I have an agency and a great partner like NewsGuard, we have controls. Now, if I'm an SME, and I would say, I don't like using words like small advertiser, because any budget for any business is significant, from wanting a return, but also their bottom line. I may be going into platforms and I may be running on the open web and find myself on some of these sites, monetizing indirectly, well, directly in fact, but through these intermediaries, dis and misinformation. And that's a problem. We need to look at that. I think we need to consider the implication for SMEs and smaller to medium advertisers who maybe don't have some of the controls in place or the ability to work with people like NewsGuard or agencies like ourselves.
Yeah, that's why we're working with a bunch of SSPs to vet their content so that they can include more legitimate journalism and exclude the opposite.
And that's so important. I mean, very briefly, to an instructive thing is that the IAB Tech Labs sort of categorization under news is quite loose, right? You can set up a site and categorize yourself as a news site, but when you dig into it, lots of these are blogs. They're not trusted news, and that's an example of the technology, without getting too wonkish about it, being a problem.
Right, and the average consumer doesn't distinguish between a bona fide, verified news source and right.
Can I jump in?
Sure.
Bob, if you don't mind, jump ahead here. I want to also broaden the context. We're talking about something that's obviously terrible, and it's snake oil salesmen. And that's been around since the snake oil salesman, before it was media. And that's something that should absolutely be addressed. And I think everybody is culpable. Everybody down the chain is culpable. A few weeks ago, Joe and I were emailing each other about misinformation. And it was political misinformation. And it was the preponderance, as January 6th came and, illuminated this whole issue, the anniversary of the riots. And it was, how can a Fox News, for instance, not just to pick on them, but they have been central to this, continue to perpetuate something that is vastly untrue, proven untrue? There is no room for doubt. The evidence is overwhelming. And at that point, that becomes equivalent to say that the election was stolen or that the rioters were patriots is equivalent to saying man did not land on the moon. And, I don't know what else, the Holocaust didn't exist. Things like that. There's a 1/100% of doubt about the Holocaust and man landing on the moon because we were not there. But the people who were there say it happened. So there's this level of misinformation that is just vastly and demonstrably untrue, and the perpetuation of a lie.
Well, that is certainly one of our criteria, and we announced with IPG a few weeks ago that we're going to start rating individual television shows.
Good.
For exactly that reason.
Good. Let me just finish this point, though, because there's a little more to go. So I said, most people don't realize that Stephen and Bob and I will definitely know this because we're in the media, but as editors, but there are 17 forms of unprotected speech. There are 17 forms that are not protected by the First Amendment. They are crimes, in fact. And only one of them is not about misinformation. You are not protected if you threaten to kill somebody. But that's actually not misinformation. That's actually correct information. I want to kill you. That's correct. And you are still not protected. But the other 16 all have some form of misinformation: slander, libel, can't lie to the IRS, can't lie to the customs, can't lie to federal law enforcement, and so on and so forth. You also can't lie in advertising. That's one of the unprotected forms of speech. And the evidence, what you just talked about, the example rather, of the snake oil salesman type ads, that's violating you can't falsely advertise. But also when Fox News perpetuates that much as misinformation, I contended to Joe, that's actually prosecutable. You can actually say this is a form of misinformation equal to slander or libel, where going into this, you're being malicious by perpetuating the untruth. So
if you spend some time with
I don't agree with
First Amendment lawyers, you're gonna have a bad afternoon, because they will explain to you through case law precedent that there is such wide berth given to speech that even having
as there should be. I don't agree with Bob at all. I don't think that it's the government's place to go after that stuff.
Well, you don't know. You disagree with me because you don't know what I think. But I'm making the observation that it would be very, very difficult to prosecute speech, no matter how heinous, even if it's the business model of a multi-billion-dollar television.
And I'm saying I think it should be difficult, but it shouldn't be difficult for advertisers to make decisions about what they want to support.
Yeah, that's true. Both are true. Both are true. By the way, when I say prosecutable, I don't necessarily mean by the government. I'm talking more about an individual.
There are civil actions against Fox and some of its pundits for I forget the name of the voting company. Dominion.
Well, there are, and there are other, Joe, sorry to interrupt, there are other remedies. They could lose their license. I mean, I think at a certain point, we witnessed with the January 6th riots, the insurrection, that the propagation of incendiary untruth creates real world consequence. So I think there has to be a real world consequence for that. Although I am absolutely, as Stephen, I think you remember, and the others, real, freedom of speech guy. And I often risked my entire career in businesses on that issue. With the rock lyrics censorship thing, I was almost put out of business. I grew up in the penthouse household where my father had to fight for his life all the time against censorship and business destruction. So I'm a real free speech guy. I've won awards for it. The only thing I ever won awards for was being a free speech guy. Very nebulous, but I did. And so I totally believe in free speech, but not unprotected free speech. You know what I'm saying? I cannot say I'm going to murder you and then say, hey, First Amendment rights, because they'll say, no, that doesn't trump First Amendment. I'm sorry. You have committed a crime. So whenever a speech is unprotected, I think it's fair game to, punish it. And this has reached a level, hence Joe and I are back and forth, has reached a level where you could say this is misinformation that deserves to be punished, even though we're all free speech advocates. And you alluded earlier, Joe, to my interview with Kennedy, in which I thought he said something very interesting about media, because I was talking about the algorithms. And he said, oh no, he said, I was talking about the hate speech and the pillow guy continuing to say that when he was stolen. He said, oh, he has the right to say that. Kennedy said, I said that 2000 was stolen from us and 2004 was stolen. I still say that. This is Kennedy, I'm saying this. And he says, I have the right to do that. Don't make speech illegal, make the algorithms illegal. And I think that's interesting because the algorithms deliberately, provocatively, knowingly and maliciously propagate something that's going to make you indignant because it keeps you going.
Oh,
You
Well,
know,
that
there is
would starve Bobby Kennedy Jr. of all his audience, because it's been shown that the platform, the social media platforms algorithms are sending people right down his rabbit holes of anti-vax stuff.
yeah, and so that's wrong too. Well, it doesn't make it right, of course. That's also equally wrong. You know, just on this indignation thing, I remember a great story Howard Stern told 20 years ago, 20 or more years ago. He said NBC, when he was at NBC in New York, did a study. And they discovered that people who like Howard Stern listens for a full 20 minutes. Very good for radio, drive time radio. But they discovered that people who hated him listened for 2 hours.
right.
And that's a great indicator of where we are today.
I'd like to get Ben to respond to the algorithm thing. I mean, there is legislation. I think Blumenthal and others have already proposed it to regulate algorithms, and they've asked Facebook and others for access to it. One of the problems is these are black boxes and they're not accessible. But Ben, do you have a view on whether we need to regulate algorithms or practices?
It's an interesting one, because we spoke just then about algorithms sort of consciously doing stuff. I'd say kind of by definition they don't. We kind of talk a lot about AI. We don't have true AI yet, and deep learning that powers some of these algorithms is inherently not nuanced. It's not human intelligence. Back to our point about the need for humans in this process.
Mm-hmm.
We know there were these problems, right? The whole flat Earth thing really came about in part because of YouTube's algorithm, because the flat Earth content itself was so sticky, it was so interesting. So people were served more of it, they watched more of this content, and of course it led them to a particular path. We are seeing the platforms make change, and I'm not going to be an apologist for platforms. There's much work to do, but we saw Google, announce they were going to pull climate misinformation from YouTube. They were going to act on climate misinformation in YouTube. So there is movement, but to your point, there is a need for a legislative agenda here. We can't do this alone, and nor can agencies, brands, or the news media. The problem is it's nuanced. It's going to have to be incredibly nuanced because of the nature of the complexity. It's why the human approach only is so interesting. But we now live in a world of algorithms. We're now surrounded by them. So this legislative framework is perhaps vital.
Yeah, I think the issue is transparency of algorithms, not so much regulating what they do. So right now, as it turns out, there are 4 different entities that judge and rate the reliability and trustworthiness of news sites. There's Twitter, there's Google, and there's Facebook, and there's NewsGuard. With Twitter and Google and Facebook, you have no idea what the rating is. You have no idea how they got that rating. If you were the editor of the Washington Post and you wanted to know, we rated higher or lower than the New York Times or than the BBC, you wouldn't even know whom to call. And if you got the person on the phone, they wouldn't tell you, because they'd say, well, if you knew how we do it, you'd game our system. We want people to game our system, and we want to be transparent, because that's the way to be accountable. So if they were accountable for their algorithms, if they were transparent, I think that would be better than regulating them, because I don't want the government in the business of telling, a tech company, here's how to do your algorithm. That's just, I don't think the government could do it competently, any more competently than they do it. But also that just takes you, I think, down a really dangerous road.
Yeah,
we've been talking about this as if it's an isolated. I mean, I don't think anyone here thinks this, but nonetheless, we've been discussing it to this point about somehow filtering bad content, misinformation, algorithmically or by human intervention out of people's news feeds or off of their TV screens. And that's part of it. But the ecosystem here is so much larger. There are so many moving parts, one of which is the Facebook algorithm, which I think is grotesque, because from an early stage, the collateral damage of it became apparent, and they leaned farther and farther in, to use Sheryl Sandberg's term, into something that they knew was going to cause grievous damage to many societies. but it's the goose that lays the golden egg, and they are completely disincentivized from trying to really do anything about it. And that's a gigantic thing. The Fox News is the sort of human version of the Facebook algorithm. They're drug dealers, and they know what content causes people to react, and they know what creates that dopamine charge that paradoxically comes from rage. And they have turned that into a $3 billion annual business, and there seems to be no position, have shown no interest in stopping, even though the democracy is on the very brink, and there's a pandemic that their rhetoric is killing. But on the sort of supply side, there's human beings who have very poor critical thinking skills, who have very poor media literacy skills, who fundamentally can't recognize the difference between one kind of content and another, don't know journalism from propaganda, and just don't know how to evaluate. But so they do the very human thing of evaluating based on their own worldviews, and if it makes them feel like their perspective's correct, they're going to consume more and more and more of it. And this is a difficult situation to be in. And by the way, there's a whole other part to the economy of misinformation, and that's politics itself, because these bad actors, like Fox News, who are distributors, or OAN, or the Daily Caller, or InfoWars, they create a money flow into politicians. And without them, the Koch brothers and the rest of sort of what is sometimes called the great right-wing media conspiracy, they enabled them to win majority representation with the majority power with majority party, by winning state legislatures, by gerrymandering and so on, with money that came from the rage produced by these platforms.
Well, let me disagree with you on one aspect of this. So far, everything you've described, you've attributed to the right side of the aisle, the conservative side.
Yes.
We have found that it is equally bad on the other side. There are liberal finance PACs posing as local independent news sites that are put on this earth in order to boost an endangered local congressman or state legislator. They're financed by political action committee money. They don't disclose it. Their about pages say, we were formed as a nonprofit in order to fill the gaps caused by the local news desert. So it's both sides of the aisle, and it's enabled by technology, and those sites get ads. They also get programmatic advertising. So it's a double-barreled issue.
It is, but one of the barrels is way bigger than the other by many tens of billions of dollars.
If I could highlight an important insight I think Bob hit on. Yes, it's not a partisan issue, it's an economic issue, but what I think he's talking about is that there's money flowing. It's not just ad dollars. So there's also cable network distribution fees. Fox makes, the reason it's resistant to the ad boycotts is because they get a lot of money from cable and satellite operators. OEN just got knocked off of DirecTV. But you also have this dark money. So Trump's new social media platform, Truth, which launches next month, already has a market cap of $5 billion. Now, a lot of that's from average investors, but I think there's other undisclosed money there too, and we don't know.
I want to get back to that deplatforming, because there is a lot of talk all the time about advertisers boycotting Fox, which I personally think would be the right thing for them to do. I don't understand why they would want to generate sales by, to me, it's like selling heroin. If Geico and Procter & Gamble want to sell heroin to increase their bottom line, I think we'd probably, they'd live forever in ignominy. But putting that aside, it's not quite a rounding error to deprive Fox of all of its advertising revenue,
Right.
but it is, I don't think it's any more than 10% of their overall revenue, which is
Right.
derived entirely from carriage fees.
Or let's
From
go.
No,
the
that's
cable
just mathematically wrong. It's about half and half. That's
Okay,
just
but
wrong.
they're resilient and resistant to it. Let's go to Facebook, which is dependent on advertising revenues. Last year, the Fortune 500 brands boycotted Facebook for a year to make a point. Do you know what happened to Facebook's quarterly earnings that quarter? They went up. And the reason for that is Facebook has 10 million clients. So the Fortune 500 are important, but they're a drop in the bucket. Ben?
Okay, good. An interesting question. I'm just going to quickly exercise my right of reply, because Steve, I thought you were sort of characterizing me a little bit as being sort of in favor of regulation. Any legislation that goes through, I think, is going to be nuanced, and will be a debate in civil society and in business around that, and in government. The fully agreed that the having the transparency into the algorithms is the important thing, and control. Right, we've made so much progress in giving people some control over ad personalization and transparency into their data and what they're seeing. That perhaps is a path forward with algorithms. But just wanted to.
I agree. No, I absolutely agree.
And
That's
I
right.
might just complete my thought because I never really got there. But I want to make the point that instead of dealing with individual advertisers on an ad hoc basis, and which I believe we should be doing, and I'm all for how NewsGuard is going about doing it. But there's a much easier way to deal with that, and that is to shame platforms, by which I mean cable platforms, whether it's Comcast or Verizon or whoever, into not being the distributor and the paymasters for these toxic propaganda channels.
Can I ask you all to talk about the platform elephant in the room today, which is Spotify? Okay, so a completely different revenue model, but the same point. What do you guys think about that?
Well, I'm hoping Steve and the NewsGuard team will get to podcasts soon, because I think podcasts are
we're actually
one we know. Yeah, one we know it's some of the most meaningful media in terms of how much it matters.
We are on our way.
But also, like we all know, podcasts are a vector for misinformation. So yes, looking forward to that one.
Well, I mean, I'm going to answer your question, Joe,
sure.
about Spotify.
Sure.
They do have a decision to make. It's obviously not going to be an availing business principle for an aggregator like Spotify to throw off everybody who they disagree with politically. However, if we're talking about a major public health menace and someone who's spewing disinformation or misinformation, much as Twitter and Facebook and YouTube have deplatformed people, I absolutely think they have not only the right, but the responsibility. Now, that's like asking, I don't know, who runs Howard Stern? Is it Sirius FM?
Yeah.
I mean, if he starts doing something that endangers the public health, are they going to kick him off? I don't know. He's their biggest asset, but they should, because as broadcasters, you still have a civic responsibility to not endanger your audience.
I want to make a point.
It's not hard for me at all for them, if I'm Spotify, to take Joe Rogan off of their.
There are 3 or 4 editors on this, in this discussion, and I think we'd all agree that if you're an editor, your responsibility is to edit. That doesn't mean the government should edit for you, but editors are supposed to say, I want people to see this stuff. I don't want people to see that stuff.
We have an obligation to be honest and truthful and accurate. We have a legal obligation to be accurate. When we're not accurate, we're punished. We definitely have a moral obligation to be truthful with ourselves and our audience. That's maybe not as punishable, but it's to me even more valid. The morality is more valid. I want to make a very, very important point here and throw a bit of a cat amongst the pigeons. First of all, I am a liberal. I know I don't sound like one entirely throughout this conversation, but I am a liberal. And I will die a liberal. And I have certainly suffered as a liberal, so there's no point giving up now. But I want to say, when we talk about misinformation, Where does misinformation start? And simply what we don't like hearing about end. Now, if you listen to a lot of what is characterized as misinformation by the left, the woke left, the politically correct left, it's anything that is outside of the, prescribed thinking, anything that we're not meant that we are meant to think that is outside of that is punishable by the left on social media and this cancel culture. We've seen a lot of that. It's really not necessarily misinformation, but it is information you don't want circulated because it conflicts with your own political point of view.
So like a received ideology. You are permitted to think this. To be pure, you must think that. And if you don't think it, you mustn't say it aloud.
It's Talibanic. There's not much difference between that and the Taliban. The Taliban will stone you to death in the town square. The left will stone you to death on social media. It's not quite death, but it can be career ending, and it is often career ending. So the whole idea of misinformation, to me as an editor, and somebody who just interviewed the most controversial person in America right now, Kennedy, it's a very, very important line to find. Where is it misinformation? To me, and I took out a third of my interview with Kennedy, a third did not appear because he was wrong. His data was wrong. He couldn't prove it. When pressed, he said, oh, I don't remember, or he would send me a testimony of some loony who talked to Congress. And I said, I'm not accepting that guy's testimony. And I didn't accept Kennedy's own articles as source material. So I took out a third of what he said. And the 2/3 I left in had a spectrum. Some of it was a little bit wanky to me, a bit crazy, but he had a fact, and the fact was accurate. And then the rest was dead on accurate. He was right. His numbers were right. His suppositions were fair. And in an interview, not a debate, and that's a big thing, in an interview, I think you ask somebody what they think and you let them say what they think. Now, my concern and obligation was to make sure there were no inaccuracies in there. Although there are some arguable ones. People say that's inaccurate, this is inaccurate, or I don't like that characterization of Fauci. I don't like this characterization of somebody.
I think you were a little too generous with him.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I don't mind thanking you. But I think you're not entirely wrong. My generosity, though, was that I felt there was an area, a nebulous area, albeit, where somebody having been invited to give an answer should have the right to make that answer, and then the public will discern for themselves. It's funny, one guy immediately tweeted, a guy called Peter Hotez, I believe, a researcher, vaccine researcher. He tweeted the night the article came out, this is inaccurate, and he gave 5 examples. In actual fact, he was wrong, and I made a response, and we never heard from him again. He got one right. I got the name of his university wrong. I called it Baylor. It was Baylor College of Medicine. But that was the only thing we actually got wrong, and we corrected it immediately. But the other points were actually, he denied getting funding that he got, and we had proof. He denied getting funding from Gates specifically, and we proved that he acknowledged it several months earlier, and it was $52 million, not a number you forget. So there was this sort of hysteria around this reflex, knee-jerk hysteria to somebody challenging the orthodoxy. And I think the point of journalism is challenging orthodoxy. I said to a friend of mine the other day who said, wow, what a great article, really loved it. I don't agree with half of it, but I loved it. And I said, in my days when I ran Spin, we had 3 of those a month. 3 of them. 3 controversial. We disproved the Atlanta child murders case and exposed Live Aid in 1 month. You know what I mean? This was the way journalism was. And by the way, we were not in a vacuum. Esquire, Rolling Stone, GQ, Penthouse, Playboy, and beyond were doing investigative reports every single issue and changing the way people looked at the world. So it's the dilapidation, the atrophying of today's media that I think is a real factor in all of this.
Can I just say, oh yeah. I mean, we're talking about the ecosystem. We have to remember that the architecture, I'm just changing metaphors, but the architecture is collapsing. We coverage of national politics doing great. We're doing great. And almost everywhere else in the ecosystem is total collapse.
Yeah.
I mean, we are more desert than we are oasis. And the fact that there is not a, talk about the best remedy for bad speech is good speech. Well, there's the bad speech is kudzu, and the good speech is dried up probably forever.
The good
So
speech is rewarded.
the amount of toxicity is extraordinary and ruinous.
Bob, if I could ask you in particular, because you are championing the Purple Project. We've established misinformation exists on all political sides and across the entire spectrum. And we end up getting into these confirmation bias bubbles and alternate realities. How do we come together as a civic society? Do you have any concrete solutions after working on this for a while now?
Well, I can tell you that I don't know about a concrete solution. I would hasten to say education, basic education about a shared a consensus on what democracy is and how it's supposed to work, and how the four freedoms are supposed to work, and how it manifests itself in the form of our government. If we had a certain baseline agreements, it wouldn't be that hard. All you'd have to do is move mountains to get civics education in schools and critical thinking skills developed from an early age. But we can't even agree on the most fundamental aspects of our democracy. It used to be the Statue of Liberty, that we understood how foundational that was to us, but that means immigration, so that's lefty. We can't talk about that. We used to talk about voting as being foundational, but no, some people are supposed to vote and some people aren't. And if you tick down the list of the things that we used to, that were carved into monuments in Washington, one by one, they're polarized. They're points of political debate.
Well, one thing we're
really
doing
hard to forge a consensus to start the democracy literacy, media literacy, and critical thinking skills.
Well, one thing we're doing to further that, we announced this week that we are getting the NewsGuard browser extension into the hands of 20 million public school children in the United States as a major news literacy initiative, because we agree completely.
That's great.
That's
great.
Yeah, I forgot to
it's
point
hard
out.
to change the curriculum, right? Until you can integrate these kinds of disciplines into all subject matter instead of trying to carve out.
We're giving it
I'm
to
a civics.
teachers who are going to do just that.
Yeah.
I forgot to point out in the intro, this is the end of National Media Literacy, News Media Literacy Week. So this is one of the reasons we're doing this roundtable now. We have a few more minutes, and then I'd like to get your concluding thoughts on this. But one thing I'd like to ask you is, we've been talking about commercial marketplaces, advertising, subscription revenues with Spotify, subscription revenues with Fox News and the cable operators, and satellite operators with OAN. But there are other actors out there. There are nation state actors and hostile foreign powers who are weaponized media and are attacking us. And this has been established by intelligence agencies. Is that something that can be addressed through the commercial marketplace?
Sure, because the way they attack us, we have found, is through the commercial marketplace, through websites that either they set up or they finance. And that's part of the work we do. And once again, the most obvious one is whoever Geico's ad agency is should do something about the fact that they're sending millions of dollars a year to Vladimir Putin.
It's not Havas.
No, it's not Havas. I think it's Horizon.
It's Horizon.
Hey, it's not a trivial question. I can demonstrate for you, if you give me a few minutes and kind of hold your tongue, I can demonstrate for you that Procter & Gamble and Coca-Cola Company underwrote the Bosnian genocide. They didn't do it on purpose. They had nothing against Muslims, but they were spending money on radio, television, Serbia in the millions of dollars, and that was going siphoned directly into the war effort in Bosnia.
Well, one of the things,
there's different degrees of culpability, and one of them is hear no evil, see no evil. Unfortunately, one of the things the free market is free of is conscience.
I won't stop.
And if your compensation is based on increasing your quarterly numbers and your market share, and suddenly the relative truth of the claims being made through your platform or through your technology, it suddenly becomes not the thing that keeps you up at night.
Well, one of the things that Procter & Gamble, one of the things Procter & Gamble and other major advertisers have done on as an alternative to being criticized that way is to decide we don't want to be embarrassed. We're just not going to advertise on news at all online. And that is really destructive. It also turns out it costs them money. We have demonstrated through a study we did with IPG, a case study, that if you advertise on inclusion lists like the ones we've created that are legitimate journalism, you actually get lower CPMs, you get higher click-through rates, higher response. So the notion of boycotting news in order to avoid the Bob Garfields of the world attacking you is really not a very good solution. They should be supporting legitimate news, because it's one of the few ways in the world where a business can actually do well and do good.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen this in terms of our meaningful media research. We did some fairly sizable panel research during the heat of the pandemic, and called Meaningful Media at the time of COVID. And we found that what was interesting is Gen Z and millennial audiences were moving back to trusted news sources, broadcast news and respected news journalism. The Guardian's publishing some interesting work around purpose and consumers understanding news context and understanding that a brand appearing next to news is supporting it. So there's quite a lot of evidence that the news content is extremely powerful. We're actually going to be publishing some research on attention. Attention metrics are the big new thing in digital advertising generally, thinking about attention, eye tracking. Are people actually seeing the ads? And the initial research we'll be presenting shows that news is some of the most impactful in terms of attention, time on the property, and the ads with it. So we know news works. We know that there's the need for the content.
So that's encouraging. But can I tell you one very brief counter story?
Yeah.
There was a woman who testified at the school board in someplace in Michigan or Minnesota, and she was furious because the school had started providing, the school system provided kitty litter boxes for the furries in the school who identified as cat.
Wow.
And and it blew up. I mean, it blew up because, you know, the libs were now they were just so pandering to those who wanted to identify as whatever, stuffed animals.
Common sense has to prevail at some point.
So right, but what her source was, as she testified, I heard. That was her source. I heard.
No, I think it was I meowed.
But if you say your source is I heard, or my source is Facebook, you still haven't said your source. You've just said, you know, what program you saw it on. And if people don't understand the most basic concept of considering the source and the source mattering and what a source is, it's a tough road to hoe.
I think I just want to throw this in the thought. I just think responsibility lies with everybody in the chain. The advertisers have some responsibility. The editors and writers have some responsibility. You know, a small matter. I mean, Wonderlust is a travel site I publish. It's small, but we never take a sponsored post ever, and we get offered them every day of the week. And you know, it's money we're turning down every day of the week. But it's just no point. I mean, it's like I've been in this business now. I'm 66. I've been in this business for a long, long time, 47 years. And I'm going to not at this point throw away my principles that what we produce should be honest. I have a pact with my readers. I've had it since 1974. What I publish is going to be honest. And that's my responsibility. And, you know, I don't do everything right, but at least that little bit right. And I think advertisers need to have more human intervention, exactly as you say, Ben. It's just ridiculous, the idea of giving a machine the ability to promote your clients. I mean, that's just, to me, bound to be a failure. And I think there has to be more education. Bob made a great point, and we glossed right past it. I would like to stop on it. Great point. Education in this country is so bad. It's so bad, and now it's so frail and timid and scared. Everybody's scared of what's going to happen on social media. No teacher wants to ever, you know, scold a child who's doing something wrong or stupid in the way they're responding. And, because of fear of social media calling for them to be fined. It's ridiculous, ridiculous. Common sense we need more of, and responsibility down the line. I think we just have to just start being adults and saying we all have some responsibility in this business. Because we could always pass it off to the next guy and say, oh, it's your platform, pal. But, are we sponsoring that platform? I mean, whether I'm on social media or we're advertising on it. And I do think of all the things that were said today that, and I hate to be the one who's sort of calling for regulation, but media has always had and does have regulation. It does exist. A newspaper cannot libel. It will be punished. There are a lot of regulations against television for their licenses. So we do need some regulation. And somebody has to find a way to regulate the social media platforms that are incendiary. I mean, in fact, they are committing another one of the criminal offenses of inciting a riot, literally. They do incite riot. They incite death, individual murders, and they incite riots. So, there has to be some point where we say, okay, this balloon has blown up so great, we can't hold on to it anymore, but we must bring it back down to earth. And we must,
broadcast news outlets are regulated, their licenses are accountable to the FCC, and they have, but social media platforms are now the dominant source of news for the American public, according to Pew. So we've covered a lot of ground. I think we could go on for hours, but I'd like to offer each of you a concluding note. I'll go on mute. So each of you, you got 2 minutes to try and sum up and give some direction where we could go.
Who do you want to start with?
So why don't we leave Ben for last, since I want to close with an ad industry thought. So Bob, you were on a nice thread there. Why don't you try and sum up, and we'll just go across.
Me, Bob? Okay, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. Well, I want to say that when we talk about misinformation, we have to, I go back to the point I made earlier, we have to define where true inaccuracy and deliberate attempt to propagate lies begins, because that is unacceptable. From there onwards, it's unacceptable. Before that, it's alternative opinions. And now the difference to me is an alternative opinion is something that is based on fact, but is just concluded differently. And in this interview I just did with Kennedy, and I'm vaccinated and boosted and flu vaccinated, and I believe in it, and I tell everybody they should do it. And I point out that invariably the people we hear about who are seriously sick and die are unvaccinated, and that when a vaccinated person gets it, they invariably are over it very quickly and have mild symptoms. To me, it's obvious vaccines are working. Now, it is also true, though, for that being an obvious, clear truth, that vaccines work and are necessary and have allowed us to live double life expectancy this year that we would have had in the same year in the 1900s, when it was around 40. Now it's around 80. So definitely, clearly, modern medicine and vaccines work. There are problems with medical institutions, there are problems with pharma, but essentially this stuff works. However, it is also true, whether we like it or not, that vaccines have hurt some people. There have been reactions people have had to them, including somebody I work with and consult right now. His wife was paralyzed for 5 months and now will have to take an infusion every week or second week of her life to be able to walk. So she had a bad reaction. That doesn't mean we throw out vaccines because one person had a bad reaction, or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000. We are going to have some, but that is true. And what I find is people don't want to hear that truth. They actually don't even want to hear that. That's a fact they don't want. They have other facts they like. And, people have died from the vaccine. There was a woman who died in the hospital where my father-in-law was a few weeks ago. Young nurse, 20s, perfectly healthy, got the booster shot, died. Perhaps she died of something else, but it probably is unlikely she only died of the vaccine. So that's a fact. It's not a great one, but it's a fact. Then you have the alternative opinions. Kennedy's opinion of Fauci, which happens to align with my own because I dealt with him many years ago when I ran Spin, when I owned a Spin and ran it. And we had an AIDS column. We found him, to be dishonest in many ways, and we published that. So I have a history with Fauci, which happens to coincide with the similar belief Kennedy has, although I don't hold with most of his beliefs, to be honest. I don't hold with most of Kennedy's beliefs. But he says Fauci markets pharma. I think that's an interesting opinion. I think it's worth bringing that opinion to the marketplace. It's worth people considering that. That to me is not misinformation. It could be inaccurate. He could be wrong, and that Fauci's the best and most honest and full of integrity guy in America. But to me, consider that he might not be, because he's a very important public servant. I think it's important. So I brought that to the public, to the consequence of fantastic unpopularity directed towards me. But I think that's real journalism. So that's my summation is we must, when we think of misinformation, understand which part of it is simply stuff we don't like, or some people really adamantly don't like, and which part of it is truly, truly and openly and maliciously inaccurate and untruthful. That okay?
Bob or Steve, would you like to sum up?
Go ahead, Bob.
We're fucked.
That beats all of us. That's brilliant. That's not a pull quote, Joe.
I've spent some years advocating for truth, justice, and the American way, and for common sense, and for rigor, and for intellectual honesty, and for basic knowledge, and it's complicated to try to execute against all of these goals. But at this stage, I believe that things are so out of control that the forces of dishonesty, opportunism, cynicism, and not to put too fine a point on it, evil, have been so successful, and it corresponds so well to the technology now available, in fact, now ubiquitous, that I think whatever we do is unfortunately tinkering at the margins. I think that we've lost to the bad guys. First, we've lost to circumstance. We've lost to the collapse of the media model, which was used back in the day when we so hated advertising, really supported an extraordinarily robust media environment all over the world. But the digital revolution undid that and delivered us a Facebook mediated world. And between that and bad faith, bad actors, money, and political opportunism, I think the black hats have won. And so God bless you, Steve. I certainly hope NewsGuard helps. I think we need for it to help, and all these other mechanisms that we bring to bear to try to create a fertile ground for truth instead of lies. God bless us all. But I'm, needless to say, not optimistic.
Steve?
Well, on that happy note, part of this conversation has made me uncomfortable, and also a little surprised to hear someone whose roots are in Penthouse magazine talk about government regulating content. I think what we have to do, what we're stuck with, is the democracy and the First Amendment that we cherish. And what that means is not blocking things, not even necessarily boycotting things, not necessarily deplatforming things, and certainly not having the government regulate our content. The five of us in this discussion could probably disagree uniformly on how we would define something that is dangerous misinformation or stuff that's just a difference of opinion. And I don't think we should let the government decide that. I think it's perfectly fair and good for advertisers to be able to decide that, and more important, for consumers to be able to decide that. And so the approach we've taken at NewsGuard is we don't want our ratings to enable the platforms to block anything or to use algorithms to demonetize them or anything else. We want them to show the ratings to people so that they can make up their own minds. All of our ratings, we call every platform, every news site for comment. If they object, we publish that objection so they can make their own decision, much the way Bob was talking about. And I think the notion that the way to solve these problems is to decide that we're going to boycott a network, or we're going to picket in front of Comcast because they have one cable show on and not another cable show. I think that leads us down a really dangerous road. It's not a road that anyone in this group has created, because it's exactly the road that the people who are polarizing this country are now using to cancel the content we don't like. I just don't think we should play their game. I think the game we should play is trying as hard as we can to give people accurate information and the news literacy tools so that they can decide what is accurate information, and inform advertisers so that they can make their own decisions about the role they want to play in our society. Do they want to help to finance this stuff that they don't believe in, or do they want to help to finance legitimate news? So that's the course I would take. I would stay away from the government doing it, and I would stay away from canceling everybody.
So Ben, the invisible hand of the marketplace or the visible hand of the government? How do you sum up?
Well, of course, the person from Madison Avenue is going to be, one, optimistic and also believe in the best system we have, which is democratic capitalism. To take the threads of the discussion in terms of news literacy, but also funding better news, we run a huge study every year, 350,000 people globally. 2021 is called our Meaningful Brand Study. 73% of respondents stated, agreed with the proposition that brands must act now for the good of society and the planet. And that's quite an impactful statement. Consumers are aware that brands have a voice, they have a responsibility, and part of that is where they show up. We are proving that news media is impactful, it's meaningful, it matters, it is the media that matters. And we are making the strides to fund quality news media. The question, or we haven't got time for a question, but I think the comment I leave on is, although we can do more, and we join Protect Our Press, we're working with local news remonetization, but Bob and Bob made points around local news, the sort of dearth of the lack of some outlets. The answer perhaps to misinformation as well as news literacy is having that media available. And the question I'd leave us on is, it seems to be really easy to get funding to do ad tech, or if you want to do some sort of Web3 rug pull. Heck, have I got a blockchain project to sell you guys? Why is it so hard to get consistent funding for new media ventures, for this kind of good media? And I think that's a capital question, priming the pump up front, we should look at.
Good point.
Okay, well, I certainly hope Bob Garfield's prediction is wrong, and that we can come back a year from now for National News Media Literacy Week and see where we came a year later. But I want to thank you all, Ben, Bob, and Steve, for having a little